Part 3, using PEP249. Now, I mentioned with the idea of using the command line as a sub-process that some commands return nothing and some commands return something. Now, the same applies, of course, to SQL. SQL commands, other than select, have 0 rows returned. So, for example, creating a table, inserting a row, modifying a row. Some select statements can be guaranteed to return just a single row. For example, select count star from a particular table, IDAC in this case. Others return one or more rows. For example, select star from IDAC. Now, I mentioned Perl DBI before, and that actually offers different methods depending on the number of things you're going to get returned. So it has a simple method called do when there's nothing returned, another method called select row array, which you can use when you can guarantee that a single item will be returned or single row will be returned, and then a more complicated thing of doing an execute first of all and then gradually fetching each row in turn when you've got one or more rows being returned. PEP249 has no such distinction. In a way that's simpler, but it means that you don't have the option to use these simple commands for when you have 0 or just one row being returned. So in PEP249 you always have to do an execute first, that executes the SQL, and then you fetch one row of data at a time. First of all, however, we need to connect to the database. And we do that using the connect constructor. And that has 5 parameters that you can pass to it. First of those is what's known as a data source name, and that's a string which specifies the connection to your database. The remaining parameters are all optional, depending on how your database is set up, and that includes the username, password, the host name, and the database name. So, for example, we could say connect DSN equals my host, so that would be the machine that the database is living on, colon, and then the name of your database, and then comma user equals somebody and password equals something. However, the MySQL driver is not fully compliant, and instead what you have to do is import PyMySQL cursors, and then you do the PyMySQL connect, so this is using the connect constructor, and you have to specify, rather than a data source name, you have to specify the host, the port, the user, the database, and the password. And the database is db equals instead of database equals, and the password is PASSWD instead of the full word password. So you can see that this doesn't exactly fit what the specification says you should do for a connect constructor. Now, this example was for a particular PEP249 library called PyMySQL. Now, there are actually lots of different PEP249 libraries available, and they vary in which version of Python they run with, how compliant they are, and so on. And this particular one, PyMySQL, is available for Python 3. It's written in pure Python, which means that it may be somewhat slower than some of the other options that are written in C. But of course there are all these other options available depending on what you require, but I think PyMySQL is probably one of the best choices. The first 4 key methods that you need to know about, other than the connect method, are first of all close, which closes a connection to a database, commit, which commits pending transactions. Now, you may have come across transactions with SQL, and these mean that basically that the database is locked until the whole of a query is executed. Now, this means that you can maintain database integrity because, for example, if you were talking in the finance world and you removed some money from one account to put it into another account, you'd have to make sure that both parts of that transaction completed, otherwise that money would just disappear if, for example, the first part completed properly and the second part didn't. So PEP249 really enforces transactions throughout, and you need to call this commit method in order to make changes to a table. Rollback is used for rolling back a pending transaction. So if you know that you're partway through a transaction and something has gone wrong, you can call the rollback method to make sure that the state is exactly as it was beforehand. And cursor is used to obtain what's known as a database cursor. And you can think of this literally as a cursor running down a table. So when you do a select from a database, what you get out is effectively a table of rows, and you can imagine having a cursor moving gradually down each of those rows in turn. So that's the way that we can look at the data that come back from a database query. So the PEP249 cursor object is used to represent a database cursor and is used to manage the context of a fetch operation. So fetching what is in the database. Now, the cursor allows you to do lots of different things. For one thing, it has an associated description method, and that returns a sequence of 7 item sequences. Each sequence represents a column, and it contains things like the name of the column, the data type, the size it's going to be displayed at, its internal storage size, and so on. So that allows you to obtain information about the database. The cursor also has a row count method which tells you the number of rows produced or modified by the last execute statement, and gives you a -1 if there's an error. And there's also an array size method that tells you or sets the number of rows that are to be read. So you can specify that you want to get multiple rows back at a time, and it will tell you how many rows you have got back. Now, there are some other methods associated with a cursor. You can close it. You can execute an SQL statement on it. You can fetch a single row. You can fetch all the remaining rows, or you can fetch a specified number of rows. Now, the cursor is actually a Python iterator, which means that you can use things like for over it. So to get a line at a time back from a database, we can say data equals cursor.fetch1. That would get a single row back. And then we can say while data is not none, extract our items of data, print them, and then do another data equals cursor.fetch1, and that would then loop round until cursor.fetch1 returned nothing. So that's one way of doing it, but a neater way of doing it, because the cursor is an iterator, is that we can just say for data in cursor. Extract the data items and print them. And that will do everything that this version did, but it's a lot simpler and easier to read. Now, I gave you a summary of a number of methods, but generally you don't need most of those. This is a basic example for pulling information out of a database. So we import PyMySQL.cursors. We set our parameters like the database name, the database host, the database user. We might have to set a password and so on. And ideally, of course, this would be done in some sort of separate config module or configuration file that you've got some code that reads that in, so that these parameters are set up and available through every piece of code that you write. Now we're creating an SQL statement, selecting the ID, the name, the data from a table where the name equals something or other. Now we create a connection to the database using the PyMySQL.connect. We're passing it the host name, the username, and the database name. We now create a cursor and we execute the SQL on it. Now, once we've done that, the cursor can now be used as an iterator, so we can now iterate through the results. And we can just say ID equals row 0, name row 1, data row 2, and print the information. I should say that this example, of course, is about extracting something from a database. But you would go through exactly the same steps if you wished to insert something into a database. Obviously your SQL would be different, and you wouldn't then have to iterate over the cursor to extract results. You would just stop with your execute. So to summarize that section, PEP249 provides a standard API. It doesn't standardize the SQL, but that is generally fairly portable, though as I mentioned earlier, there can be extensions and so on. Because PEP249 is a recommendation, not all drivers are fully compliant, and we saw that the PyMySQL driver is not completely compliant. ODBC is an alternative, but we haven't really talked about that here. And there is a basic 4-step process to use PEP249. First of all, we make a connection, then we have to create a cursor, then we execute the SQL on the cursor, and then we fetch data from the cursor. We also have learnt that the cursor can be treated as an iterator, and therefore we can avoid using the fetch statements directly and simply iterate over the cursor to get lines back. Now I mentioned earlier that there are other drivers around. Of course these examples have been for Python 3 and the driver was PyMySQL. There are a couple of Python 2 drivers. There's one called MySQLDB and one called MySQL.connector. MySQL.connector has been a particularly popular choice for Python 2. For Python 3 there's MySQL client, which is quite low level and not fully PEP249 compliant at all. MySQLDB is the one that we've talked about. That actually sits on top of MySQL client to provide PEP249 compatibility. MySQL connector, which I mentioned for Python 2, was also available for Python 3. It's PEP249 compliant, but it hasn't been supported since Python 3.5. Here are some useful URLs. So the PEP249 standard that I mentioned at the beginning, the PyMySQL project, this is the Python connector, and the fact that it's not supported for later versions of Python, some general questions about using Python with a MySQL database, and here's quite a nice tutorial, but it uses MySQLDB instead of PyMySQL. MySQLDB, as I mentioned, hasn't been ported to Python 3, and again it has been saying that it will be since 2018, but that hasn't happened. So this one is worth a look because it gives you some nice examples, but of course you would have to port them to something like PyMySQL instead. But since they're both PEP249 compliant, it doesn't require too much effort. If you're using Linux and you are on your own machine, so you don't have these things installed already, then you can install PyMySQL locally as an end user with pip3 install --user PyMySQL. If you want to install it centrally for everybody to use on Fedora or CentOS, you can use DNF or yum followed by install -3 PyMySQL, and on Ubuntu it'll be apt-get install -3 PyMySQL. We're going to stop at that point, and in the practical you will query the MySQL database that you've used previously.